In the wild and often chaotic story of ancient Rome, few names spark as much controversy and fascination as Elagabalus, born Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. At just 14 years old, he vaulted from the incense-filled altars of a Syrian temple straight onto the throne of the world's greatest empire. And what followed? It wasn't just strange. It was a cultural earthquake. This wasn't teenage chaos or royal immaturity. Elagabalus arrived in Rome carrying a religion, a worldview, and a sense of identity that defied everything Roman society thought it understood. He wasn't Roman by custom or spirit. He was the high priest of Elagabal, a sun god worshipped through music, dance, and Eastern rituals that made Roman elites deeply uncomfortable. To understand how such a figure came to power, you have to look east. At the time, Syria was a vibrant crossroads, a fusion of Greek, Persian, and Semitic traditions, where gods, cultures, and empires collided. Elagabalus grew up in that world, surrounded by chants to the sun and the smell of incense burning on black stone altars. But his rise to power wasn't just mystical, it was deeply political. Behind him stood one of the most influential women in Roman history, Julia Maesa, his grandmother. After the assassination of Emperor Caracalla, the empire fell into the hands of an unpopular general named Macrinus. Julia saw an opening. She spread a daring rumor that her grandson was Caracalla's secret son. Maybe it was true. Maybe it wasn't. But it didn't matter. The Eastern legions either believed it or were paid well enough to act like they did. In 218 AD, Elagabalus was declared emperor. Macrinus tried to crush the rebellion, but he was defeated at the Battle of Antioch. Just like that, Rome had a new ruler, a boy emperor from the East, crowned by soldiers more loyal to gold and gods than to Rome. But this wasn't just a change in leadership, it was a revolution in disguise. At first, the real power was meant to stay with Julia Maesa and her daughter. Elagabalus was supposed to be the pretty face of their scheme, young, pliable, easy to control. But things didn't go according to plan. On his long, symbolic march to Rome, Elagabalus began purging supporters of the old regime and centralizing power around himself. And when he finally reached the capital, it wasn't as a Roman emperor, it was as a living god. He arrived in gold, in silks, in perfume. He wore makeup. He spoke not with political authority, but with divine conviction. With him came the sacred black meteorite, the physical symbol of Elagabal, his god, which he enshrined on one of Rome's most sacred hills. And that was only the beginning. Elagabalus didn't just introduce a new god, he declared his god supreme. He demoted Jupiter. He rewrote the hierarchy of the heavens. As high priest, he performed rituals in elaborate Eastern costume, leading ceremonies that blended mysticism with spectacle. To conservative Romans, it was blasphemy. To Elagabalus, it was destiny. His rule wasn't just eccentric, it was explosive. In only 4 years, he didn't just scandalize the empire. He exposed its fault lines, its fears, its fragility. Elagabalus became a symbol, not of chaos, but of how vulnerable Rome truly was to change, to influence, to collapse. When he fell, Rome tried to erase him. But history remembers, not as a footnote, as a reckoning. Picture Rome, a city carved from stone and conquest, where gods wore armor and tradition ruled everything. Now imagine it suddenly kneeling before a black meteorite, under the command of a teenage high priest dressed in silk and gold. That was Rome under Elagabalus. From the moment he set foot in the capital, it was clear. Elagabalus didn't come to govern. He came to remake. Religion, culture, identity. He tore out the heart of Roman ritual and replaced it with Eastern fire. Gone were the cold ceremonies of Jupiter and Mars. In their place, daily processions pulsing with drums, incense thick in the air, wild dancing, and erotic rites to the Syrian sun. God Elagabal, and the emperor didn't watch from a distance. He led them, draped in embroidered robes, jeweled crowns, veils, and perfume. Elagabalus became a living deity. To the Roman elite, it wasn't just shocking, it was obscene. But it wasn't just the religion, it was him. Elagabalus blurred every boundary Rome had. He wore makeup and women's clothing. He demanded to be called Empress. He's said to have sought surgery to make his body match his self-image. He married women and men, and even took a Vestal Virgin as his bride, violating one of the most sacred taboos in Roman religion. His court turned into a circus of provocation, outdoing even Nero in spectacle and scandal. The Senate was stunned. Commanders were uneasy. State business crumbled beneath layers of incense and ritual. Military campaigns were ignored. Civil authority was handed to Eastern priests. Senators were dragged into ceremonies they didn't understand. And Elagabalus? He thrived in it. His palace, once the nerve center of Roman power, was transformed into a temple complex, draped in Eastern fabrics and carved with foreign symbols. At the center stood the black stone of Elagabal, elevated and worshipped. Every day was filled with hours of ritual. Laws were delayed. Diplomacy stalled. Wars waited. But the emperor never missed a single rite. Taxes soared to fund the construction of shrines and temple feasts. Merchants suffered from constant religious holidays. Craftsmen were ordered to create ceremonial art instead of tools and goods. Even the gladiator games, Rome's blood-soaked pride, were twisted into awkward, spiritual pageants that confused and bored the crowd. And all the while, real threats were closing in. Barbarian raids intensified. Governors in distant provinces resisted the bizarre new orders. In the West, murmurs of revolt turned to open unrest. Elagabalus didn't negotiate. He punished. For many, this wasn't just misrule. It was humiliation. Rome's power had become performance. Its gods were props. The throne had become a private altar. And the empire? It was bleeding under the weight of one man's vision. The final breaking point came when Elagabalus tried to rewrite marriage law, dismantling family structures and pushing reforms seen as dangerously immoral. What began as quiet discomfort turned into outrage. And when he tried to make these changes official, Rome stopped whispering and started fighting back. Because Rome could endure scandal, eccentricity, even madness. But it would not endure weakness dressed as spectacle. Even Julia Mesa, the political genius behind Elagabalus's rise, saw that things were falling apart. The dynasty was at risk, and so were the power structures she had carefully built. Quiet conversations began to ripple through the Senate, the military, and the palace. The goal wasn't just to remove Elagabalus. It was to replace him with someone more stable, someone who could keep Syrian influence alive without the chaos. That someone was his cousin, Alexander Severus, young, obedient, untainted by scandal. Support for Alexander grew quickly, especially among the Praetorian Guard. Elagabalus had kept them loyal with bribes and gifts, but the endless ceremonies, the disregard for military values, and the rise of incompetent favorites had tested their patience to the breaking point. By early 222 AD, a full-scale conspiracy was underway. Senators, generals, even members of the imperial court quietly aligned themselves with the boy emperor in waiting. Meanwhile, Elagabalus was unraveling. Ancient accounts speak of paranoia, mood swings, and erratic behavior. He cut himself off from former allies, imposed stricter punishments, and doubled down on his rituals. As the imperial court grew colder, even those who once defended him began to drift away. The end came swiftly. On March 11th, 222 AD, Elagabalus arrived at the Praetorian camp, bringing Alexander with him, expecting a routine appearance. Instead, he walked into a silent coup. The guards had already sworn loyalty to his cousin. When Elagabalus tried to assert control, they ignored him. When he tried to run, they stopped him. The execution was brutal and immediate. The 18-year-old emperor was stabbed to death by multiple attackers, leaving no room for survival. His mother, Julia Soaemias, was killed alongside him. In a matter of minutes, the Syrian dynasty that had once ruled Rome was erased. Their bodies were dragged through the streets, mocked, desecrated, and finally thrown into the Tiber River. It was the kind of treatment Rome reserved for traitors and monsters, a final act of damnation. In the days that followed, Elagabalus's world was dismantled. His religious reforms were abolished. The sacred black stone of Elagabal was sent back to Syria. Temples were rededicated to traditional Roman gods. Under Alexander Severus, guided by Julia Maesa and her daughter, Rome returned to familiar ground. A formal damnatio memoriae was issued. His name was struck from records, his images destroyed. But erasing Elagabalus proved impossible. His story, wild, disturbing, and unforgettable, survived in every chronicle that followed. Writers like Cassius Dio painted him as the embodiment of Eastern corruption and moral collapse. Medieval historians amplified the scandal with layers of outrage. But modern scholars see something more complex, a cultural collision, a challenge to Roman gender norms, and a religious experiment that was centuries ahead of its time. Some now believe Elagabalus may have expressed a transgender identity, seeking physical transition and asking to be called Empress. If true, that would make him the first known trans ruler in history. Others argue this reflects the ritual roles of Syrian priesthood, not modern gender labels. Either way, Rome couldn't, or wouldn't, understand him. What is clear is that his effort to replace Jupiter with a supreme solar deity wasn't madness. It foreshadowed later reforms under emperors like Aurelian and Constantine. But his timing was wrong. His methods were reckless, and without public or military support, he had no chance. His reign became a lesson. Power is never absolute, no matter how divine it pretends to be. When Elagabalus lost the loyalty of his inner circle, no ceremony could save him. Even Julia Maesa, who had lifted him to the throne, ultimately chose to end his rule and preserve the dynasty through someone else. But his story didn't vanish. It lingers as a reflection of Rome at a breaking point, a place where cultures clashed, identities shifted, and the limits of imperial control were tested. His spending wrecked the treasury. His dismissal of military power exposed the Senate's irrelevance. And most of all, his existence forced Rome to confront what it feared most: the other, not as a foreign army, but as an emperor wearing gold, perfume, and a different truth. In the centuries since, Elagabalus has become myth, twisted into a symbol of depravity by painters, writers, and filmmakers. But behind the scandal lies something deeper, a glimpse into a changing world. Because long before Rome embraced monotheism or questioned gender roles, Elagabalus had already gone there. And though he ruled for only 4 years, his impact rippled far beyond his lifetime. In the end, Elagabalus wasn't just a reckless boy emperor. He was a spark, chaotic, defiant, and unforgettable in the long transformation of the Roman world. And nearly 2,000 years later, we're still trying to understand what he really was.